Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to interview engineers with the aim of reducing your interview dropout rate. I'm Patrick Charles, Customer Success Lead at Cord, and this is Tom, our Chief Product Officer.
Hey, everyone.
What we're going to be looking at today is just to give you a bit of an overview of the structure. Firstly, an introduction on why your interview process is important. Secondly, what engineering candidates' pain points are. Thirdly, what we should be offering them during an interview process. Fourthly, some new features, which Tom is going to take us through. And finally, Q&A, which we'll wrap up with as well. So to jump into it, quick introduction on why this is an important thing to be focusing on. Some of this, it may seem obvious that interviewing is a very important process, but obviously it's time consuming, it's costly, and what we really don't want at the end of that process is for people to be dropping out or for people to be not completing the entire process. So what we've done is we've interviewed 300 engineers who were actively looking for work and basically asked them questions about what they want in an interview process so that we can help you to build a process which A, engineers want to complete, and B, which gives them all of the information they need so that they feel informed at the end of that process. To start off with, just to give you an idea of how important this is to people, we asked out of this group of people, would an experience in the interview process they'd had impact a decision on an offer from that company, either positively or negatively? 89.4% of those said yes. So it's very likely that how you conduct this process is going to affect the ability to bring a candidate on at the end of it when you get to that offer stage. And another thing to kind of emphasize the importance of this. I don't know if anyone remembers from the last webinar we ran, but in a different survey, we also asked about candidate experience and found that 75% of candidates wouldn't apply to a position if they'd heard poor things about the candidate experience, either at the company or kind of during the process for that when they were applying for a job. So two key stats there that I think really important to show why this should be an area of focus. So the effect of this interview process, essentially, what we're trying to do here is focus on process so that we can increase the number of engineers who are willing to enter that process in the first place, as we've just seen from those stats. Secondly, decrease the dropout rate and increase the chances of an offer being accepted. Improve the candidate experience and hiring reputation in your community, and also increase the longevity of hires by ensuring that both parties are making a well-informed decision. And we'll come on to this fourth point in a little bit more detail later, but it is really important for that to be a kind of two-way and connective process. So on to the next part, which is kind of the pain points for candidates that they find during this experience. And it's all very well kind of knowing what these are, but also we're going to do a bit of a dive into how we can solve these, what's coming up the most, and what candidates are saying about those. So to start off with, we just asked, what are the main points, the main pain points that you experience when interviewing for technical positions? So the first thing was not receiving feedback after interview, 52.3%, then lengthy interview process at 49.3%, and then long technical assessments at 40.2%. So some quite three standout winners there of the sort of top three pain points, which we're now going to dive into in a little bit more detail about what's said and what we can do to solve those. So firstly, 52% of candidates frustrated by not getting feedback. And one quote which demonstrates this from a lead backend developer who was interviewed at the time: talk to me, keep me up to date, and say why not if that's the case. This might seem like quite an obvious point, but it's something that is obviously the most mentioned thing. It really matters to candidates, and it's not a hugely time-consuming process for people to do, but it is something that slips quite a lot. So I think it's really important, especially when we think about that 75% figure of candidates that wouldn't apply to a role if they'd heard bad things about an experience. This is a place that you can kind of stand out as a company, make sure that you're doing this really well. So the first thing to say is always provide feedback throughout the interview process. This will improve transparency, trust, and also really helps with candidate performance. You know, if someone can improve on something that hasn't gone so well in the first interview, for example. The next thing is to just make sure that you're doing that at every point in this process. So make sure you're doing it whilst you're kind of in the interview stages, but also at the end of the process as well, as not doing so can kind of damage the reputation there. And there's a couple of quotes from these candidates. So as candidates, we need to be provided with proper feedback after the technical interview. So this person specifically speaking about going through the point of a technical part of an interview process and how they want feedback after that, which obviously can be quite a time-consuming part of interview processes. So good to make the most of that. Secondly, I'd love it if any time you do interview, there was a feedback loop on how you performed. Again, this is something that if you do, you can stand out a bit more as a company. Thirdly, the biggest issue is the lack of response from companies, either initially or after an interview. So this point touching a little bit on that start of the process as well, giving a kind of response to applicants, but then also making sure that that continues throughout. On to the second pain point, which was lengthy interview process. So 49% of candidates struggle with a lengthy interview process. This figure actually also rises as you go up in the seniority. So it's 51.2% for senior engineers, 58.8% for lead engineers. Obviously, as we get to those higher seniorities, there can be more and more stages. So it's important to try and work out how you're conducting those at different seniorities as well. And someone here, a sort of mid-level backend developer, said, I find the software engineering interview process to be excessively lengthy. Expanding a 3-stage interview doesn't necessarily ensure the selection of the best candidate. So what we dived into a little bit deeper here is where is the cutoff point in terms of what people consider to be a lengthy interview process. So we asked how many stages would deter you from completing an interview process, and kind of got this graph which gradually increases, where obviously at one interview no one's really put off by this, and 5 stages or more would put everyone off from applying for these roles. I know that this is difficult to control in a lot of ways, and there will be pressure from stakeholders to run multiple interviews, but this is quite a good thing to kind of build a case around how many stages you are running as a company. I think the key takeaway from this for me is that 4 stages in an interview process could lose you out on up to 84% of candidates at some point in that process. And again, as we talked about at the start, it is a time-consuming process to go through, and what you don't want is to have 3 interview stages with a candidate and for them to be put off by a 4th stage and drop out of that because you've essentially wasted those kind of 3 hours or however long it was in conducting that process yourself. So really be sure to consider carefully the number of interview stages that you kind of need in that process. One thing that came out of this when we kind of dive more into the specific quotes that people left about this as well is that laying out your interview process clearly for applicants is really important. One of them said, I prefer job positions where the whole process is clearly laid out before applying. Again, this is about transparency and being upfront, people being aware that they're, even if they're committing the time to this, then they know that they're not going to have to go through 5-6 stages of an interview process. Next thing is, wherever possible, try and keep your interviews at fewer than 4 stages to risk deterring the majority of candidates from completing that. One thing to do here is condense interview stages. So, for example, if 2 people were going to conduct interviews on their own, try and combine these so that you're not splitting those out into lots of stages for the candidates. Third pain point that we had was technical assessments. So we asked, in what environment do you feel would best demonstrate your technical skills in an interview process? The out-and-out winner here was technical assessments with 46.1%, and then technical Q&A down at 28.4% as the second winner. So what we wanted to do is then have a bit of a look into why technical assessments seem better and what we can do to kind of try and make sure that this works as the technical portion of the interview. So firstly, a bit of a look at why candidates wanted take-home tests. They felt that they basically gave the following benefits, which was replicating real-life working conditions, most similar to how they're kind of how they would be expected to perform if they were to accept the job and move into that new position, and also allow them to showcase their skills in a familiar environment. Two quite similar answers, but both came out with slightly different language. When we look at the quotes, one being sort of about moving into being able to show how you're going to move into that job, and the other being about sort of not feeling pressured in a situation where you're, for example, doing a live coding test, and it being like a sort of familiar scenario to how you're used to coding in those situations. However, one thing to kind of mention on this is that 40% of candidates also said that they were frustrated with long technical assessments. And so what we looked at then was similar to the interview stages, what would be counted as a long technical assessment for a candidate. So we asked what length of technical assessment would deter you from completing it. And again, similar to what we looked at with the interview stages, obviously no tech test wouldn't put anyone off, and then up to 5 hours was putting off 100% of people, and we have a gradual increase between as we kind of go up in terms of the length of time they're expected to take there. I think the key take home from me here is that up to 61% of candidates would be unwilling to spend up to 2 hours on technical tests. So when you're selecting that technical test, really bear in mind the length of the assessment to make sure that people are willing to conduct that. Again, this also, the sort of importance of this will depend on where that comes in your interview process. But if, for example, you've gone through 2 stages of interviews with someone, you don't want to kind of produce a 2-hour technical test, which will then deter them from going any further in that process. So another thing to mention on this is that it's important to be flexible, dependent on experience. Now, in a similar way that we looked at with the interview stages, as we got to a more senior level, people were kind of more frustrated by the length of it because they tended to see them more. Actually, junior candidates were far more accepting of technical tests than the rest of the market. Only 26% of junior candidates selected this as a pain point compared to the 40% average. And they were also, in the graph that we just saw on how long people were willing to spend on that technical test, they were far likely to be happy to spend longer on that. I think that indicates, and when we look through a bit more of the information that came out of that from quotes, the senior engineers felt that, you know, with 6 to 10 years software engineering experience, for example, they weren't necessarily needing to do those technical tests to prove it. And often one theme that came through from things that people spoke about was not wanting to have to do technical tests which were far too simple for their ability. So when people have a sort of standard technical test that everyone just needs to do, as you get more and more senior, this starts to feel like more and more of a waste of time. So the key things from this is, firstly, if you do need to technically assess candidates, then the best thing to do so in is a take-home technical test, because that's what candidates are most likely to want to do. Secondly, then try and keep your take-home test to ideally below 1 hour to absolutely maximize the chance of people doing it, but up to 2 hours at the most to really not risk putting off the majority of those candidates. To wrap up a couple of key points from those kind of pain points we touched on then. So feedback is an absolutely key part of the interview process and the thing that was most complained about in terms of pain points. Applicants want feedback in all points of that interview process, both in between the stages and at the end of the interview process as well. A lengthy number of interviews can have a very detrimental effect on the number of engineers who make it through the process. Really, if you want to get a good number of people going through that process, 3 interview stages max is an ideal number. And finally, take-home tests are the preferred way to demonstrate technical ability, but really time-consuming tests will gradually increase that dropout rate, especially as you get to those more senior levels. So the next thing we're going to look at is what the candidates want and what we should kind of be offering during this interview process. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things that came out of this survey was that the active engineers who were looking for work really feel like a lot of the time the interviewing process doesn't feel particularly two-way. And so for a candidate, obviously, it's very important to understand how a company operates and also to kind of meet key members of the team and feel like they've got all of the information that they need to make that kind of final decision. So we're always trying to make sure that it feels like a two-way process, and remember that the candidate is trying to sort of find the right fit as well as the company. Also, give them access to the right information will ensure that they have a good experience and that they feel like they've got a well-informed decision at the end of the process. So to dive into this, we asked candidates to select the three things that are most important for them to understand during the interview process. The top three things we had here were remote flexible working policy, salary and benefits package, engineering process and culture, and also exact role and responsibilities. So these are kind of the key things to be focusing on when you're trying to give people information about the company. Make sure that these are clear at the beginning of the process. Try and maintain the interest through that. I think an interesting one here is that, you know, a lot of the time when candidates come into an interview process, a lot of the thing that people are trying to convey is the company culture. Now, this survey is specific to engineering candidates, but, you know, slightly maybe unexpected, that company culture as a whole is right down towards the bottom of the list of things that are most important. They want to know about the things that directly affect them, like those engineering processes, the culture in that team, the benefits, the remote working packages. So it's important to remember when you're interviewing different types of candidates that these things will vary, and make sure you're communicating the things which will affect them the most. The next thing we looked at is which of the following people do you think is essential for you to meet in order to make an informed decision? First of these was direct line manager, then peer from your team, and then the CTO and head of engineering. So these are the people that they most want to meet. Obviously, for a lot of people, talent managers is an initial interview process, and not to surprise that at all, but engineers want to meet the CTO and their direct line manager slightly more than that. These are really important people to try and involve in that interview process so that it feels like there's a bit of a direct connection to that. So make sure that you remember that meeting these correct people is vital to help them make that informed decision. A quote that came out in regards to the kind of meeting people was that it's off-putting to meet too many people in the interview process, and someone felt that it really didn't give them enough time to build any rapport or for the interviewers to properly understand them as a candidate, and left them feeling disconnected from the company and employees. So this is quite an important one to remember as well. If you are trying to get people face to face with all of these different kind of stakeholders, then remember that like meeting too many people can cause some friction. And I would suggest maybe trying to keep one consistent person through this interview process. Now, to go back to what we touched on earlier with the feedback, this could be a really easy way to have a kind of consistent voice throughout that process so that someone does feel connected to the company. It's just someone who's feeding back each time, helping them to kind of manage that process. So some key points from that section on what candidates want. Firstly, ensure that the information that matters to candidates is communicated clearly and early during that interview process. Include people that candidates want to meet on the interview panel, not just the people that you might want them to meet. One of the things about that is then to also try and limit the number of people involved so you don't overwhelm the candidates or add unnecessary stages. For example, you know, a final stage for an engineering candidate, maybe meeting some co-founders or meeting other people from the teams might not necessarily be so important to them, and if it adds a fourth interview stage, could be detrimental to that. Cool. To wrap up on some of the key takeaways from that survey then, and what we've just looked at, this interview process is really, really important, and 90% of candidates are influenced by the process when it comes to making a final decision, and 75% wouldn't apply if they've heard poor things. So it's a really, really key part of sort of hiring practice to make sure that you're on top of and constantly improving this process. Always give feedback whenever possible. That includes in between interview stages and at the end of it, to just let candidates know how it's all gone and make them feel like they're heard. Then also, when you've got to use technical tests, make sure that it's a take-home technical test to give the best chance to that sort of highest percentage of candidates, and try not to make it too lengthy as well. Try and clearly convey the interview process, the salary, the engineering culture, and the kind of benefits and holiday package in those interviews as well. Ideally, as close to the start of that process as possible to build that rapport, maintain interest, and show people exactly what they should be expecting. Also, don't have too many stages or an overly long technical test, as it will deter a high proportion of people from applying. And don't put candidates in front of too many unnecessary people, as it can overwhelm this interview process and make them feel like they don't have a strong connection to anyone that they've met during it. That's it from us. Really hope you guys enjoyed the webinar and found it useful to get a bit of an understanding of exactly what engineering candidates are currently asking for during that interview process. If you do have any questions about it or anything in general, then please feel free to email me at patrick@cord.co, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future for our next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Very much. Bye.